going to.
Hey, so hello everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce you all to our friend and colleague John Dunne, who serves as faculty of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he holds the Distinguished Chair in Contemplative Humanities at the Center for Healthy Minds. Professor Dunne is also currently serving as departmental chair at the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. Professor Dunne has been an active participant in the dialogue between Buddhism and science on many different fronts. He co-founded the Collaborative for Contemplative Studies at Emory University, where he previously served as associate professor at the Department of Religion. He's a fellow of the Mind and Life Institute and has in the past served on the board, on its board of directors. He has also taken part in many of the dialogues between scientists and His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other Buddhist representatives that were fostered by this institute. Aside from his academic presence, Professor Dunne also teaches sometimes for Buddhist communities. Finally, he also serves as an academic advisor to the Rangjung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu, Nepal, founded by the Tibetan Lama Chokinima Rinpoche. So with you all, John Dunne, Professor John Dunne.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna and James. It's a real pleasure to be here and to join you all. I guess the plan here is I'll talk for about 40 minutes or something, roughly. And then maybe we'll have a little bit of a break and then some conversation. And I look forward to maybe at that break time, we could kind of go around and introduce each other. Would that make sense? Or do we want to do that now, Anna and James?
It's as you wish. I mean, I guess it can be after, the break time makes sense.
Okay, we'll do that then. So I'll just be a talking head for a little while here. I understand that you've read my article on inner science, and I'll be going over some of that. And I'm very interested to hear what questions and so on you might have. Let me begin by saying that I'm imagining that you're already familiar, based on what I recollect of what James and Anna have told me about what you've been studying. You're familiar with the idea that basically the notion of Buddhist science is clearly, in terms of the way we use the word science, has to be a modernist notion, but also that it comes out of the resistance of primarily Sri Lankan Buddhism to colonialism. And so that the articulation of Buddhism as scientific was really a kind of response, I should say also Japanese Buddhism, a response to colonial pressures and a kind of European triumphalism. And so the interpretation you'll find then of the attempt to kind of scientize Buddhism is in some cultural historical works like the couple of books by Donald Lopez, and also David Rickman's book, The Making of Buddhist Modernism, is going to be an acknowledgement. And Donne's I think, work is especially kind of maybe almost, shall we say, let's just say he doesn't hold back on his critique. I think David McMahon's is a little bit more even-handed, but all of these works kind of take the assumption that this is a kind of strategy that is really driven primarily by social, cultural, political concerns. But there is, and when we then think of the contemporary situation, updating ourselves now from mid-19th century up to the late 20th century, the Tibetans start to get involved, and this really starts to happen around 1980. When His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been in exile since 1959 in India. And he, all along as a young man, and even as a boy, really had a great interest in mechanisms. He used to take watches apart and put them back together. He used to tinker with a car that they actually had in the Potala Palace in Lhasa. There wasn't really anywhere to drive it. Or it was in the Norbalinka, actually, in Lhasa. There's an apocryphal story of him, you know, getting it started one day and smashing into stuff, you know, but being the Dalai Lama, he probably didn't get into too much trouble. And, you know, he had this kind of fascination with mechanical things, which later turned into really a fascination also with science. And he, as an individual, was very influential in creating this kind of dialogue between scientists and Buddhists, which eventually led to the formation of something that Anna mentioned in the introduction, the Mind and Life Institute. And by the way, many of the dialogues, if not all the dialogues, but many of the dialogues, including several that I'm involved in or that I helped to organize, are actually available online. So if you ever wanted to poke around and see what those are actually like, you can see videos of most of those dialogues online through the Mind and Life website. So in the modern times, then this kind of rapprochement, but that's not even the right term, this very notion of Buddhist science is something that His Holiness the Dalai Lama and therefore Tibetan Buddhism has been especially prominent in. And so whereas in the mid to late 19th century, early 20th century, it's especially the Sri Lankan Buddhists, to some extent Japanese Buddhists, who were promoting Buddhism as a kind of scientific religion, along with some of their Western allies. It's really now especially in the late 20th century, starting around 1980, when the Tibetan Buddhists begin to become very prominent. And most of the current dialogue between Buddhism and science is really focused actually on Tibetan Buddhism. And I will therefore be talking from that perspective primarily. And I'll say a little bit more about that. I want to point out a couple of things that you know, that are relevant and that could be of interest for you, which are volumes in this series, the Science and Philosophy in the Tibetan Buddhist Classics, which now that's volume 1, which is on the physical world. And then volume 2 is right here. This is the second volume, which is on the mind. And actually this cover is kind of an old cover. It's out of date because actually I'm one of the authors of this. There's a long story about how that happened, but I also have written a series of introductory essays for the 6 parts of this volume. And when it becomes available, you know, I'll see if I can at least send James and Anna a copy once it becomes available so that you could peruse it. There will also be a launch of this happening in November, and I'll try to send you the details of that, where we'll actually do an event with the Dalai Lama, so you can actually participate in a sense in one of these moments of, you know, Buddhist science. Now this term, just to clarify, this term Buddhist science as we use it now is really, I'm not too clear that this exists in the 19th century material in the literature. The idea that Buddhism is scientific exists, but the idea of something that we could call Buddhist science is, to my mind, possibly a fairly recent coinage. And it's a coinage that actually certainly comes, in my experience, comes directly from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was tried to make a distinction between what he calls Buddhist religion, or in Tibetan, Nangpe Che, Buddhist philosophy, Nangpe Tadrup, or Nangpe Tawa, or Nangpe Drupta, but mostly Tadrup, and then Buddhist science, Nangpe Cendrick. And that term, that last term itself, so far all of these terms, you know, Nangpe Che, Nangpe Tadrup, those are traditional terms. Nangpe Cendrick, Cendrick is actually a neologism for the word science. So it's very interesting to say that we're going to talk about Buddhist science, and the volume that I just showed you is actually a translation, except for my own essays, is a translation of a compendium that the Dalai Lama sponsored, asked a group of about 6, I believe it was 6 traditional Tibetan scholars to go through the Indian texts and extract Buddhist science from the Indian texts. And when they're in the process of doing this, what they're looking for, therefore, is this Nangpe Cendrick. So, which is itself, the irony here is the claim that there's Buddhist science in those texts, but in order to speak about Buddhist science, you have to use a neologism, which doesn't exist in those texts, like this term Cendrick, which I'm not even sure about the etymology. Maybe we can chat about that later, what the etymology is, James. You might have a thought about that. I haven't had a chance to kind of look into what's the etymology of Cendrick. So there's a lot of reason to say, and along with Don Lopez, we might say this is just a kind of fabrication that is, on the one hand, starts out as a kind of resistance to colonialism and Western triumphalism, and then later becomes a way of promoting Buddhist exceptionalism. And I don't know if you've been looking at Evan Thompson's new book by any chance. In the course, but Evan Thompson then, really addresses this in this book, Why I Am Not a Buddhist. Evan, my very good friend, who we had, let's just say we disagree on some things, but Evan's point is really that, this whole idea of Buddhism being scientific, or even the very notion of Buddhist science, is now moved beyond kind of the colonial resistance to a sort of exceptionalism, like Buddhism is special. We're not just, able to resist the colonialists. And part of the argument that's made there in that context, as I think, is that, well, your religion is primitive. Ours is scientific. You God believers are, you have a primitive religion, tribal primitive religion. We have an intellectual, rational, scientific religion. So it's actually moved beyond that resistance to a kind of triumphalism about Buddhism being special, special, not just sort of, in relation to science, in relation rather to Western religion, but in relation to not even just all religions, but in fact, kind of culturally special in this very unique way, which I think there is a good argument to be made that the whole move toward the very notion of Buddhist science and the coinage of that term, the creation of this tripartite structure, which I think only dates to about 10 years ago, by the way, Nampe Chur, Nampe Tadruk, Nampe Cendrick. I think that's about, I think I might have been there when the Dalai Lama came up with it, in fact. 10, maybe 20, I'm not sure, at my age, anything more than 2 years ago is just a while ago. But but in any case, that's actually a pretty recent coinage. And it does fit to some extent, Evan Thompson's critique of Buddhist exceptionalism. So I'm saying all of this because what I want to lay out is that there is this critique, and there is a way in which part of what's going on here is Buddhists, even sometimes in a very self-conscious way, like His Holiness has, maybe in public, certainly in private, pointed out how part of the issue here is making Buddhism relevant, right? That Buddhism needs to be, in order for Buddhism to be relevant, it in some sense has to seem like it's important in the world. And one way to do that is to point out how Buddhism, in a sense, is scientific. So all of that might then make you think that, well, Buddhism, why do we call, all of this is really just kind of, a cultural game, and we shouldn't really take seriously the idea that Buddhism is scientific, or even the idea of something that we could call Buddhist science. And I'd like to push back a little bit about that, but I'd also then like to use this as an opportunity to say that part of this opportunity, part of this very notion also can end up being a critique of a certain model of what we mean by science, and that this interaction between Buddhism and science, therefore, also can actually be not just a critique of a certain kind of Buddhist exceptionalism, but also a critique of science as the exceptionalism of science, if you like. And we'll try to get into that today. So the first thing I want to say about, in terms of, and you know this from the essay Inner Science, my essay on inner science, and that was written, by the way, for my first, really kind of the first person I studied Buddhism with was Bob Thurman, whom some of you may know as father of Uma. But I was Uma's legal guardian for a few years, but that's a whole nother story. Bob's, really kind of one of the people who coined this term, inner science, which is the predecessor to Buddhist science. And I therefore am writing that essay in a particular way. I would probably be a little bit more critical if I weren't writing it for a festschrift in celebration of Bob Thurman's 70th birthday. Because I personally actually have a lot of issues with the very notion of Buddhist science. But there are ways in which we can say that there are elements of Buddhism that are scientific. And let's just review some of those, even though I think there are, what I'm going to talk about now is probably mostly in that essay, which I didn't get a chance to reread. So one of these is basically a kind of commitment to empiricism. And there are various ways of understanding what empiricism means, but I'd like to kind of point to two. One of them is a sort of a way of understanding empiricism in a negative sense, and another is understanding it in what you might say an affirmative sense. So an empiricist stance, to borrow a phrase from the philosopher Bas van Fraassen, is a stance that rejects the possibility of evidence from testimony, essentially. More specific, this is the way the Buddhists would articulate this. This is called what's called aptavachana in Sanskrit. And by the way, even though we're kind of focusing on the Tibetan account to a certain extent, that means we're going to go back to Indian texts that the Tibetans rely upon. And those are going to be texts that are, for our purposes, Mahayana texts of Mahayana Buddhism, the kind of reformed Buddhism that emerges around the start of the Common Era. And those texts are all going to be written in Sanskrit. So I may be throwing some Sanskrit at you here and there. So in the concept here, the way the Buddhists will articulate this is that in order for us to establish that something is the case, we might want to appeal to the speech of a reliable person, or aptavachana. And paradigmatically, the speech of a reliable person, rather paradigmatically, a reliable person could be a person who is considered to be in some sense or another a saint or an enlightened being or what have you. And so the founders of the great traditions, the great philosophical traditions of India, like the Nyaya, the Vaisheshika, the Sankhya, the Jain tradition, and so on, the founders of these various traditions would be considered to be apta in this sense. They are reliable. And so we can actually use their speech to prove that something is the case. It can be used, and to articulate this in very precise terms, it can be used as evidence, or a linga in Sanskrit. It can be used as evidence to establish some kind of a thesis or proposition. So that position is the position that in order for one to have an empirical stance, that position has to be rejected, which is to say that testimony is not probative. Now, interestingly, one of the ways in which this gets articulated in the Buddhist tradition is in the context specifically of asking, well, what do we do with scripture? And that brings up the philosopher Dharmakirti. It's kind of hard for me to give a talk without at least mentioning him once. And today we'll probably mention him a fair bit. So he is a 7th century Buddhist philosopher who we often refer to the works, his works, and then the commentarial tradition that descends from him as the Buddhist epistemological tradition. It really covers more than what we think of traditionally as in the West, as in Western philosophy, as epistemology, but that's a rough equivalent. In the term that's used in Sanskrit world is pramana. So this is about the means of reliable knowledge. A pramana is a means or instrument of reliable knowledge. And one of the claims from the non-Buddhist traditions, and actually some Buddhists as well, is that this testimony of a reliable person, which in effect really means scripture, is a means of reliable knowledge, because you can use it as evidence to prove something, okay? So what Dharmakirti is going to do is he's going to say that actually that's not the case. And this turns out to be quite radical. In fact, it's so radical that you cannot universally say that this is true, even for all Mahayana Buddhists, right? It's certainly not true for all Buddhists. It's not even true for all Mahayana Buddhists. And the Tibetan Buddhists, when they interpret this material later, actually kind of backtrack, so that you'll find a lot of ambiguity about whether they fully endorsed Dharmakirti's position that scripture is not probative. It's not a means of reliable knowledge. Dharmakirti's point is simply that you can use scripture. So Dharmakirti is going to set out 3 epistemic spheres. One of these are contexts. One of these contexts is the context of something that's called perceptible, prachaksha. The second is something that's inferable, right? You can use inference or anumana to know it. And the third is something that, the first one, of course, is a perceptible, something that's perceptible. An object in the first category is a perceptible object. An inferable object is not going to be directly perceptible, but it is inferable based upon on some perceptible property, or based on some perceptible effects. And it's easiest to understand this in terms of a causal inference. In other words, we can infer the existence of something even though we can't see it directly based upon the effects that we can observe. So based upon we see smoke coming over the hill, we can infer the presence of an incendiary source because we see the effects of that incendiary source. And then the third category of epistemic objects are what are called in Sanskrit achanta paroksha. So the second category are things that are not perceptible. They could be not perceptible because they're remote or inaccessible in time or in space or in their nature. But their effects, primarily their effects are what we are accessible to us. In the third category are things that are completely inaccessible. So these would be things that you can't infer because you have no causal interaction with them of any kind whatsoever. You don't have any interaction with them directly through the senses, and you have no interaction with their effects. So on Dharmakirti's position, there are some of these kinds of things that are logically impossible and therefore can be disproven. So Dharmakirti has a famous argument against the notion of a creator God, because he thinks that the possibility of that a creator God would be impossible if you attribute through the creator God the quality of being permanent. So he has a famous argument in one of his texts in which he goes through this in some detail. So you can actually disprove some of these kinds of entities. If we say God is in principle imperceptible to us, we cannot directly contact his work, so to speak. He got the ball rolling, but that's too far away, too long ago. We have no direct contact with that. So we can just say he exists, but and that's all. We can't even say that for Dharmakirti because we're attributing contradictory qualities to him. But there could be other kinds of entities, other ways of thinking about God, for example, or many other kinds of entities that are in principle not perceptible in any way, nor inferable based upon their effects, and yet we might want to assert their existence. And the way that other traditions and some Buddhists then assert the existence of such things is by scripture, or what we can call the testimony of a reliable person. So Dharmakirti goes through a careful argument that's actually discussed in a book I wrote about Dharmakirti, and you can have a look there. But the upshot of this argument is that the only context in which you can use that kind of evidence, which is scripture, to try to prove something, is when you, first of all, that object can't be inferable, it can't be perceptible, it's got to be in that third category. And you feel like if you don't make some kind of a judgment about this alleged object, you will not be able to advance in your practice, in your contemplative practice, in your practice of Buddhism. And therefore, you can use scripture as a means to come to a judgment about this. But, and then he very carefully says, you have not proven anything. And that's the statement that especially people get very uncomfortable about, meaning some of his Indian colleagues and later Tibetans. In other words, scripture does not prove anything. You cannot use scripture to prove anything. You can just use scripture in a psychological sense to make you feel better about something, in effect. So that's a very clear empirical stance. And then Dharmakirti even goes further and says, the only kind of scripture, if you're going to need to use a scripture where you need to, you need to establish that something is the case, like, for example, that there really is an axial mountain called Mount Meru at the center of the universe, and you really need to establish that that's the case. Let's suppose that that's in the third category, for now at least. And then if you really need to establish that for some reason that's important for your practice, but you can't perceive it and you can't infer it, you can use a scripture, but the scripture you use has to be not contradicted by anything that you can infer or perceive. So the specific kind of inference he's talking about here is what's called Vastubala Pravrta Anumana, which basically means empirical inference, inference that operates by the force of things, right? So an empirical inference, an inference based upon what you can perceive directly. And so if you have a scripture that makes any claims that contradict what you can perceive, then you can't use that scripture. You can't use some other part of that scripture to prove something that's completely imperceptible or uninferable. I hope that's clear. So in other words, your scripture has to, if you can use a scripture to prove something that's otherwise completely unprovable, You're not really proving it, though. You're just kind of giving yourself a judgment so that you can advance in your practice. And if you're going to use the scripture that way, it has to be completely uncontradicted by anything empirical. As it turns out, there are actually very few scriptures, even in the Buddhist world, that meet that criteria. Because a lot of them make claims about things empirical that turn out to be incorrect. Now, famously, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has even now moved more recently to a position where he says even Mount Meru, which in some accounts, this axial mountain at the center of the universe, that even Mount Meru is actually not something that's in that third category of being imperceptible and uninferable. He says it's actually in the second category. It's something that we should be able to infer, and we can't. So actually, we should reject the existence of Mount Meru and many other things of Buddhist cosmology, is what His Holiness has said. And interestingly, I one time was at an event with for a bunch of donors, a few hundred people. This was at Emory University, and there were some, monks as dignitaries sitting in the front row, and he was saying exactly this. One of the first times he said this, about 10 or so years ago. And he says, I think we should just, the issue of Mount Meru came up, and he was in a dialogue, and he said, I think we should just throw it out. And he kind of waves his hand like this. And when he did that, the whole front row of monks went, ooh, it's like they couldn't, it was just a little too much for them. So there's a lot of, so what that tells you is that even though this is a principle, that this kind of principle of empiricism is a very strong element of the tradition, it's still, there are a lot of people who can be very uncomfortable with it. But as a feature of science, it's, I think, as a feature of what you might call one aspect of what we mean by scientific, it is actually one way in which we can say that Buddhism is unusually compatible with science, which is that unlike most other traditions, in fact, I have not yet encountered a tradition which says that none of its scriptures prove anything. So that is unusual, actually, to actually have to make a very strong, very clear statement that our scriptures don't prove anything. Anything you can prove, you have to be able to prove empirically, meaning using the evidence of the senses. So that's one way in which we can say it's not just a fantasy, it's not just a kind of cultural ploy, an anti-colonial move, a move towards some kind of exceptionalism to say that Buddhism has something that is compatible with science, which is the empirical stance, if you like. But then there's another feature, a second feature that we can talk about is actually, so on the one hand, there's this kind of empirical stance. On the other hand, there is the notion that in some sense or another, and this is an intriguing, starts to bring up some issues about what we mean by science. There's some sense or another in which actually uncovering what is the case using empirical evidence, in some sense or another, is a sort of good in itself. Now, in the Buddhist world, the idea is that we suffer and that our suffering is a result of ignorance, which we could translate as really a kind of misknowing, right? Where we are basically confused. We're wrong about the nature of our identities, the nature of the way the universe exists, and so on. And so counteracting suffering, this is shared, this particular kind of approach is shared by a number of Indian philosophical religious traditions. Counteracting suffering requires that we know the nature of reality. And we could say that part of what seems to emerge, if I'm not going to get into the details of the history of science, but when we ask where does science in a sense emerge from, part of it seems to be this notion that in some sense or another, discovering the truth will free us. So that is actually something else that as a kind of driving motivation, explicit in the Buddhist case, maybe not so explicit in the scientific case, except when we think of technology. Of course, when we think of applied science, technology emerges out of the claim that we've got it right. We understand Bernoulli's principle, and that's why planes don't fall out of the sky, for example. So that's those claims that claim that in some sense the truth kind of advances us, moves us forward in that very modernist way, right, is going to make us, reach that some kind of a continual advancement of humans, You see this in all kinds of elements of quasi-scientific futurism. For example, the idea of the transhuman, or what's going to happen post-singularity to us humans. All these kinds of ideas, Harari's book Homo Deus is an example of this. That there's this sense, in some sense or another, that not only is science kind of getting the world right, but by getting the world right, it actually makes things better, and we specifically get better. So that's actually a very intriguing way of thinking about a parallel that's not very well commented on between the Buddhist notion that truth really does set you free in a sense. It does, knowing the way things actually are removes your suffering, and that there's a kind of implicit, especially when you see the way in which science is realized in cultural context. There's something about science which also drives in that direction. So we have empiricism. We have the idea that empirical knowledge gives us some kind of a truth about the way things really are, and that way things really are is going to make everything better in some sense or another. It improves things. Those are two features. Then when we think about science, a third feature is something that I know that you've been reading about, which is this idea of objectivism. So there are a variety of approaches to objectivism. I managed to look a little bit at the reading that you did for I think for this week it was, on subjectivism and objectivism. And I just want to show you real quick one version of objectivism coming from Mark Johnson. The world consists of objects that have properties and stand in various relationships independent of human understanding. The world as it is, no matter what any person happens to believe about it. The world is as it is, no matter what any person happens to believe about it. And there is one correct God's eye view about what the world is really like. In other words, there is a rational structure to reality independent of the beliefs of any particular people, and correct reason mirrors this rational structure. Concepts map onto the objects, properties, and relations in a literal, univocal, context-independent fashion. Words are arbitrary symbols which, though meaningless in themselves, get their meaning by virtue of their capacity to correspond directly to things in the world. So this is a particular kind of way of thinking about objectivism that has some resonance with the material I was reading. I couldn't finish it all. Definitely has some resonance, but goes much farther, for example, than Kant's insight about the distinction between the objective and the subjective, or the noumenal and the phenomenal. So this is a kind of straw man version of objectivism. And what's in the straw man version, just so that we can understand, like the easily critiqued version of objectivism? It's that, first of all, there's a world out there independent of human minds. Second, that world out there independent of human minds is accessible to human minds. And third, that the features, and especially what you could say, the regular features or structures of that world out there, in some sense, are captured by the features, the regular, predictable, universal features and structures of human cognition. So one example of this that I especially like is when Mark Johnson, apparently, I was told this by his close friend, Bob Macaulay. I wasn't there for this, but Bob swears it happened. Mark Johnson went to Georgia State, I think it was, to give a talk to the mathematics department, and they didn't realize quite who they'd invited. So he was basically saying, one version of this is to say that mathematical objects are real things in the world. And so when a mathematician is doing math, the mathematical object in their mind is actually, in a sense, the mathematical object out there in the world. And this is kind of the purest form of this idea of a correspondence, that the structures of math, as they're occurring in the mind of a mathematician, are just the structures of math, are just the structures of reality itself, right? That they are, in a sense, the structures of the universe. And this then often is articulated in a position called physicalism. And there are a few definitions, but one definition is that the real is what corresponds to the laws of physics. And of course, the laws of physics are held within the minds of humans. So that's the kind of strongest version of objectivism, which is that the structures of your own cognition are not just reflecting the structures of reality, they are in some sense identical to the structures of reality. that kind of objectivism is something that allows us then, if one holds that position, of course, part of what that means is that when we're doing physics or math, that what we're doing actually is we are directly engaging with reality. And so the conclusions we come to when we do physics and math are going to be conclusions that obviously are about reality itself. We don't even have to do a translation between our cognitive content and what's real in the world. So one of the features of that kind of objectivism is something that you'll see why we can critique it fairly easily shortly. But one feature that actually runs through all versions of objectivism is that this is not an ordinary feat. And that's where the chapter you read, I think, is really quite helpful. Our capacity, in a sense, to think in a way that corresponds to the structures of reality, to have cognitive operations that don't just correspond to the structures of reality, but actually are the structures of reality, requires special training. And so the idea of the objective here is not just that the contents of our thought are actually real objects in the world, right? Which happens with math and physics, but that it's not subjective. So there are really two meanings of objective there that are important to keep track of. One of them is the idea that somehow or another, a very strong version of objectivism is that the contents of your thought actually are real objects in the world. And the second is that it's not subjective. So this is a feature of not just of the scientific method, but it's a feature of also, you could go all the way back to Indian texts and not just the Buddhists, the attempt to eliminate what we can call the subjective from our knowledge, so that reliable knowledge is not in some sense subjective. So what do we mean exactly by that? What we mean is that when we are engaged in a process of trying to understand something empirically, that the differences between your cognition and my cognition are not relevant to understanding what is the fact of the matter. So that if a scientist has indigestion, a neuroscientist in New Delhi, who maybe had a little too much to eat at lunch and has indigestion and is working on his fMRI image interpretation, and then there's a scientist in New York who has a hangover and is working on his fMRI image interpretation, the analysis of the data, that even though one has a hangover and the other has indigestion, that the fact of the hangover and the indigestion are completely irrelevant to the results they arrive at. The fact that one's a Star Trek fan and the other likes Tolkien is completely irrelevant to the conclusions that they arrive at. In other words, that there are features of their knowledge of what's happening in their cognition that is universal across all individuals, and that those universal features, that we can engage in a method that removes anything that obscures, in a sense, those universal features. We can get rid of the subject, right? And again, in the way that it's used in the chapter. We can get rid of, in other words, the individual differences, variations, likes, dislikes, biases, etc., of individual humans. Now, the kind of absurd endpoint of this position in modernity is what's called eliminativism about consciousness, which is to say, basically, there are no individuals; there are just brains. This is like the Churchlands, for example. Paul Churchland, and I forgot his wife's name. Does anyone remember? I don't remember. But anyway, the Churchlands would be an example of eliminativists in this way. It's that actually there really aren't any persons. There are just kind of brain machines that are doing what they do. The attempt to completely eliminate the subject is something that we see as a really strong feature, especially of the 20th century modernity and late modernity. And postmodernist movements are often, in a way, a kind of attempt to bring the subject back in a dramatic way. But setting that aside, when we look at Indian epistemological systems, including Buddhism, this is also something that's very much recognized as an essential feature of reliable empirical knowledge. That our empirical knowledge also cannot be simply a matter of what we experience individually. Instead, it's something that we, in a sense, can come to an agreement about. And this is part of the reason why debate actually was an extremely important part of the epistemological tradition, because debate was a way of coming to an agreement about what was the case. And there are various methods that are used in order to arrive at this kind of consensual knowledge, if you like, in which individual tastes and biases and so on are eliminated. I won't go into those details now, but I'll just say that this is also definitely a feature that we have to, in a sense, have a kind of knowledge that is not simply tied to our own individual subjectivity. So that's another feature, not just of Buddhist epistemology, actually, but of Indian epistemology in general, which is quite sophisticated in this particular arena. The question then, oh, I see, I've already gone quite a ways here. I'm going to try to wrap up more quickly than it's going a bit longer than I anticipated. Sorry about that. So then the next question is, well, in what sense then, so we have these features of Buddhism. We have a very strong kind of empiricism, which is admittedly unusual in philosophical religious traditions of India and the world, which is with a rejection of scripture as providing reliable testimony. In a certain way, a rejection of what we might call the supernatural, depending on how you define that. We have also an emphasis on a kind of objectivism in knowledge, which is to say, where we define objectivism in that second sense as that which is not simply subjective, and that there are methods, and that also the agreement that this requires training, that to really get good at that kind of knowledge, you actually need some training in order to produce that kind of knowledge. In the Indian context, you need training essentially in a kind of let's just call it logic to make it easy, which would be like a mathematical kind of training. So those features are the same. So what's not going to be the same about Buddhism is there are going to be a couple of things. One of them is that and in what sense is Buddhism not scientific, and why it's actually really misleading to call Buddhism, to use the term Buddhist science, and why I'm pretty uncomfortable about it, is that part of the assumption of science is that there's that part of the method here is not just a method for eliminating subjective features of how we arrive at knowledge, but also it's about how we advance our knowledge. How do we improve our knowledge? How do we refine our knowledge? How do we gain knowledge of areas that we didn't have before? In a sense, how do we move things that used to be trans-empirical in that third category of the Buddhists into the second category? How can we move from something that is completely inaccessible to us to something that is accessible? And that's where the scientific method becomes relevant. The scientific method, a hackneyed version of it, and it's a complicated thing, and you're probably aware of the various historians of science. Everyone talks about Thomas Kuhn. He's an obvious one. Paul Feyerabend is a kind of wild man who goes even further than Kuhn. He's very interesting as well. But it's not so simple as the scientific method would suggest. But the basic idea here, and that we do see that this is the case, at least institutionally, is that one creates hypotheses based on theories. Those hypotheses are tested, and then based on the results of those hypotheses, revisions are made. So one of the biggest problems from the standpoint of calling Buddhism science is the very idea that Buddhism is engaged in this kind of revision, because it's not. So we have not had revisions to Buddhist science. There are very complex accounts of cognition, of perception, of the mind. You can read about those in that volume that I sent you the link for, or that I showed you. Here, I'll chat you the link for it so you have the link. There certainly are quite science-like accounts. I did send you the link. There are certainly science-like accounts in this material, but none of this stuff has been revised for about 1,000 years. So that doesn't sound like science, really. I'd be interested to hear what your opinions are. So that's a way in which it's not scientific. Now, when we ask ourselves, and there's going to be a third way it's not scientific, which is this very heavy critique of objectivism. So we're going to circle back to that question about why there's no revision in a second, and let's just move into the critique of objectivism. So one of the maybe issues with this kind of tripartite division of Buddhist religion, Buddhist philosophy, and Buddhist science is, first of all, that's a new division. That's not, no, you won't find traditional Indian texts or Tibetan texts talking in this way. But on top of it, it separates Buddhist philosophy from so-called Buddhist science. And that's highly problematic, because here's one way of thinking about this. So Dharmakirti, that philosopher, gives a very elaborate account of perception, very elaborate account of inference. You can read about it in that forthcoming volume. It's really, the scientists that have interacted with this material often find it quite intriguing, and they get ideas from it. It's clearly not the same as our science, but it definitely gives them ideas. It's quite rigorous. And so Dharmakirti will say, let's say, for example, if we're trying to establish what it means for us to see blue, he gives us a causal account of the visual process and explains how concept formation works in that context. And at the end of it, after he's done this for hundreds of pages, he then makes a certain move in all of his various texts. He makes this move in some way or another. And the move is to say, basically, but of course, this is just the way things look to us. And in the end, what he will say is that ultimately, none of these ordinary perceptual operations are ultimately true, because they don't conform to an objective world, an objective mind-independent world. Because there is no such thing as an objective mind-independent world. So objectivism is like a fantasy. It is the fantasy that we all operate with, the sense that there is, kind of an objective world out there. But it's precisely for Dharmakirti a fantasy. In fact, it is kind of the most basic form of confusion or ignorance. It's one way of thinking about this. So some of you have probably seen the movie The Matrix. I don't know who's not seen The Matrix. Sometimes, you haven't. Yeah, there's always someone in this generation now who has never seen The Matrix 4 is coming out apparently. So better catch up. But it's a computer generated reality that everyone is actually living in, and they don't know it. This is also, interestingly, you guys are in Stanford. This is actually a very popular opinion in Silicon Valley still. There's a Swedish philosopher whose name is escaping me right now, who's written a paper that's convinced a lot of people that it's more than likely that we're also all living in a computer-generated simulation. And the idea here would be that, of course, it all seems real to us. This is kind of Dharmakirti's position. It all seems real to us. And within the matrix, so to speak, within the way it looks to us, we can come to these definite conclusions about things. We can come to what seems like objective knowledge. But of course it's not, because it's all just the matrix. It's all just, in a sense, a projection of our minds. That would be a simplistic way of putting it. A better way of putting it is to say that the objects that we are observing are themselves constituted by our intersubjective reactions and actions toward them. Another way, let me just restate that again, that when we're talking about objects actually are themselves the products of our own intersubjective reality. They are constituted by our own intersubjectivity. So that when we are operating together and we are in agreement about whether this is blue or not, or whether I'm making sound or not, that all of that, of course, works within the framework of human cognition. So then so that's going to be Dharmakirti's final position. But that actually also tracks down to, and I'm going to stop in a minute, that also then tracks down to something that's a deeper point, which is that even when he talks about supposedly objective knowledge, even there he says, well, it's objective only in the sense that it is, what really we mean by this kind of reliable knowledge that is not just a matter of our biases, is that it's effective knowledge. It enables us to do stuff predictably. And you'll find this as an account of scientific knowledge as well in some philosophers of science. In other words, it's our capacity to predict what's going to happen that constitutes reliable knowledge. But the reliable knowledge itself is built on categories that do not exist in the world. So even when he's not at that highest level saying, hey, we're all in the matrix anyway. He's saying, no, it's not the matrix. This is real. He has an interesting philosophical approach where he takes different levels of analysis. Top level is it's all just, projection in a certain way. Lower level, no, this is real. But even when we take all this stuff to be real, even there are categories that we use to describe the real, including mathematical categories. Those categories do not exist in the world, and they don't map onto anything in the world. They work because he has certain ways of accounting for concept formation that explain why they work, and I can't get into those details now, but I can send you some materials if you're interested. They work, and that's what it means for us to have reliable knowledge, is knowledge that works, that gives us reliable predictions. But none of those categories exist in the world, and they don't even correspond to anything in the world. We fabricate them. So then the key element here that really is a kind of pushback against science in a certain way is the idea that there are no natural kinds that exist out in the world, first of all, and that the structures of human cognition are producing the kinds of objects that we take to be categories in the world. So that it's a weaker version of the matrix position. It's basically saying that when we're able effectively to kind of interact with this, we'll suppose it's a real world somehow, there's stuff out there, and there are reasons why we're able to do that, and we can come up with an explanation of it. But something that we don't need in order for it to work is the idea that there are real categories that correspond to the categories that we use. In other words, that reality is divided up into natural kinds and so on. So what that position means is that when we engage in the process of coming to some kind of a reliable knowledge about the world, what we could call objective knowledge, that process is based upon the categories that we bring to the world, and in a sense that create the objects that we study. A really interesting example in contemporary context is the bold signal in fMRI studies, right? The blood oxygen level differential signal in fMRI studies. That signal actually is the product of the process. It's a product of the fMRI machine. It doesn't exist in the world unless you make an fMRI. There's no bold signal until you have an fMRI. So an fMRI creates that signal, and much of neuroscience uses, right, fMRI data, bold signals, and that signal actually is not a thing in the world. It's a thing that's a product of our scientific process. So that idea, which it means that when we're trying to arrive at this kind of knowledge, we're already starting with, we have to impose categories on the world. And the question is, where do they come from? Why are we getting these categories? And this then brings all kinds of things, both in the Buddhist context, but also the contemporary context, things about cultural hegemony, things about various ways of conceptualizing identity, social identities. One very simple way of putting this, not quite a Buddhist way, the Buddhists would talk about the intersubjective, we would talk about like social reality, that those categories are coming largely from our social reality, but also very specifically from Dharmakirti's position, they're coming from what we're interested in doing, what our goals are, where we're trying to go. And this then really calls into question, in a way that the Dalai Lama actually says, this is what we can offer to science, calls into the question of value neutral science, calls into the question actually the very notion of there is no ought in is. And that kind of critique ends up being a sort of ethical critique. It's a way of noticing that the categories that if Dharmakirti and the other Buddhists are right, the categories that we're deploying to do our science are actually the products both of our culture, of our social reality, but also the products of what we want to do in the world, or what we want to do to the world, or what we want to do to each other. And that those motivations lead us to produce that kind of knowledge, which therefore is not going to be free of those motivations. So in that sense, it's never fully objective. It's always going to be rooted in not just the subjective structures of our cognitions, but also in a sense in our appetites, in our goals, in our vision of what the way the world should be, rather than the way the world is. So I'll just finish by saying this helps us then to explain why the Buddhists, one way of thinking about why Buddhists kind of stopped revising stuff, because their goal was not to, for example, make airplanes or iPhones. Their goal was to train people in a particular way. So they got to a point, you might say, this is the kind of nice way of putting it. Obviously, there are we can come up with other ways of explaining why Buddhists stopped revising things, and that are a little bit more critical, shall we say. But this is one version that probably does make sense. One of the forces that was in play was that they got to a certain point of an account of the mind, an account of cognition, an account of how inference worked that you can read about in that book that's forthcoming. And that was good enough for them to get to their goals. And their goals were not about manipulating the external world. It was about changing people, right? It was about transforming individuals. And since that, and if that for their purposes was good enough, that's kind of an empirical question for us too. Do they succeed in transforming people through their version of science, so to speak? If that was good enough for them, then that they stopped. So that's one way of understanding, in a sense, why Buddhism sort of stops being scientific at a certain point. It stops needing revision. I think there's obviously a lot more to say, and there's much more critical things we could say, but I'm going to leave it at that for now.